Cheryl Johnson-Odim, welcome to Columbia College's Anti-Apartheid Movement Oral History Project, Part 2.
Thank you.
Yes. So, to start with, I want to ask what you remember about being a part of the 2009-2010 Chicago anti-apartheid movement.
When you say 2009, 2010.
I mean the oral history project.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
my bad.
Because I'm thinking it was long before that.
Yeah.
I had, my first introduction to apartheid really came when I grew up in New York, and really came when I was about 12 or 13, and was chosen as one of 9 kids to sing on an album with Harry Belafonte. And at the time, he was so long a progressive sponsor of actions for social justice. And he was sponsoring a South African dance troupe that was touring the U.S. to talk about apartheid. They were called the South African Boot Dancers. And he took all of the kids that were on the album to one of their performances, and then they talked to us about apartheid. So I say that as contextual background for the fact that I was already, revved up and ready to go long before I became officially involved. So I was involved in some things in New York, but I came to Chicago to do graduate work at Northwestern. And I guess it was about 1980, because I was in graduate school with Prexy Nesbitt, and also Lisa Brock, and thinking who Alice Palmer, who was another person who was involved. And I'd known Basil Clooney from New York. And I say all of this to name some of the players. In about 1980, Prexy Nesbitt and I co-founded a group called the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa, the acronym for which was CIDSA, C-I-D-S-A. And there was already stuff going on in Chicago. There had been long celebrations of African Liberation Day and other things. Other people had been involved. But we formed this in particular to try to get the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and universities within the state of Illinois to divest from any funds that were invested in South African corporations or in corporations that dealt with South Africa. So I'll just say one more thing before you go on with another question. So particularly the years, I'd say, between 1980 and 87 were my deep involvement, because in 88 I had a baby and a lot of things changed. But the movement itself, really its heyday was between 1980 and I guess 1994, when South Africa had its first free and fair elections, and the 80% of the population that was designated as African voted, and then Nelson Mandela was elected, the first African president of South Africa, and then made a trip to various places to thank all of those who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So they were tumultuous, wonderful, difficult years. So.
Yeah. And what specifically about the oral history project the first time do you remember? Was it weird, like seeing everyone again, or?
No, because I never lost touch with everyone. In the activist community, many people stay in touch around various and sundry kind of issues. So the anti-apartheid movement was one major issue for those of us in the activist community, but there were other issues that sort of outlasted. I never speak of the end of apartheid, because in my estimation, although the official construct and state sponsorship of apartheid has ended, the fact is that the impact of that end has been subtle and not nearly significant enough. In other words, there's not been any real redistribution of land, and other issues. So, trying to force an end to the state sponsorship of apartheid was an important issue in the activist community. But even after that state sponsorship ended, there were a number of other issues that, people had been involved in. So all of these people I continued to be in touch with, so it wasn't like I wasn't in touch with them anymore.
That's awesome. Um, I think what I want to ask next is about your Fulbright Fellowship. What were your thoughts leading up to your departure to Nigeria?
Well, I'd never been to Africa before. This was in 1975, 76. So I was there for a year in Nigeria. And, I was very excited. Without the sponsorship of the Fulbright Foundation, I would not have been able to afford to go to Africa for a year. And so it was exciting. Also, it was an important milestone in my graduate study because I did a doctorate in African history with this subfields in American history or United States history, which is what I prefer to say, and in women's history in the U.S. And if you didn't go to Africa to do the research for your dissertation was looked on as being a little less authentic, I guess, or credible. And so, I applied for several different fellowships, and the Fulbright was the best one that I received. And so I was very happy because I'd get to Africa on somebody else's dime, because I didn't have a dime to do it on. I would be able to do a dissertation that would be credible and authentic, quote unquote. And I just wanted to, particularly as a Black American, experience the idea of going to Africa, and not just as a short-time tourist, but to sort of live among the people for a year. So I was ecstatic when I got it.
So you got multiple scholarships?
Well, the Ford Foundation, and what was the third one? I don't remember, but there were a couple of different offers. Everybody applied for more than one to be sure that they hopefully got, as we used to say, into the field. And in fact, my graduate work was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. Without that fellowship, I never would have been able to do a PhD, and certainly not at Northwestern. So I was, those were the days when, you could go to grad school on a fellowship. It's changed a little now, but...
Yeah. How did you stay motivated as an activist after, or I should say, how'd you stay motivated as an activist since 2010?
Yeah. Well, I was an activist all of my life. When I say all of my life, I'd say starting by the time I was 14. So it was a part of my identity, a part of what I did and do. There were various times when I took a little time off from being, so to speak, metaphorically on the front lines, either because of things to do with children, that I have 3 children, or things to do with just needing a little mental health break. But staying activated has never been a problem. I mean, after 2010, for instance, I was involved in a couple things. One of them was I was among the organizers of the January 2017 Women's March, after the election of Trump. I thought that I'd step back for a while, but when he got elected, oh my God. I mean, I was just so gobsmacked, like almost everybody else in the country, that I was like, I cannot not be a part of this. So, I never had it, as long as there were social justice issues to pursue, that was my motivation. I didn't, and there were always various issues at the forefront, but fundamentally there were still issues that sort of threaded through all of them, whether it was poverty, whether it was women's issues, whether it was LGBTQ plus issues, whether it was racial issues, whether it was, anti-Semitic or religious or Islamic, issues. So there are plenty of issues to keep you motivated. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. A little more focused now. How did you feel about anti-apartheid organizations that weren't integrated or refused white participation?
Or refused white participation? I felt that it would take all of us, but I understood. I mean, if you're thinking about, like, you know, the Azanian People's Organization or things like, I mean, in South Africa, because there weren't very many here who refused white participation. There were some who preferred to be all black or black-led at least. So I was not entirely critical of those. I knew that it would take more than just black people, but I was not entirely critical, particularly inside South Africa, even though there were white people inside South Africa who were active in the anti-apartheid movement. Small in number, but very active, and many who gave up their lives, people like Ruth First and others. But still, you know, when you are in a position where you are the oppressed, and, you know, just like in, say, the abolition movement against slavery, you don't want to feel like you're giving up your leadership, your representation, your voice, if you will, in a leadership role in the struggle to people who, while they may not themselves as individuals be those who oppress you, are still privileged in the process and can step away from the struggle at any time. And, you know, so if organizations chose to be only black and black-led, I frankly completely understood that. Now, when we formed CITSA, we made a decision not to be all black, but we also made a decision to have black leadership. And we made a decision to have a woman in a leadership role. So Prexy and I were co-chairs because we did not want to have just an all-male-led or an all-white-led organization. So that was a deliberate decision. Now, both of us were fully prepared to do that. It wasn't like some kind of, you know, choice of people who weren't going to be able to bring to it what all-male or all-white leadership would be able to bring to it. We've both been involved all of our lives. We were people who were well-versed on the issues. You know, we were, you know, perfect choices for leadership, but we did make a decision to be an integrated organization because we thought it would take everybody.
Awesome. And what was your involvement in the Springbok protests in Chicago?
I was only involved in that peripherally. Lisa was really the one who worked with Dennis Brutus on that Springbok tour. So, you know, I was involved in a consulting role. I was involved in, you know, knowing what was going on and saying to Lisa this, that, or the other. But I didn't take leadership in the Springbok tour.
So were you ever like, so when you say you were peripheral, like could you expand more on that?
What I mean is that I wasn't involved in a way that took me to the protests.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was, you know, my real deep period of involvement, both in leadership, in being there, and organizing, and all that sort of stuff, was really, I'd say between 1980 and 86, with our role in having a trial here in Chicago. And, you know, oh, I'm so sorry. I will turn this off.
That's fine. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you to silence your phone.
Yeah, I thought I had turned it off. Okay. So, you know, I feel more comfortable talking about the details of what my involvement was in not just constructing strategy, but implementing strategy, you know, organizing protests, working toward the trial that we had in 1984 here in Chicago, which is one of the first trials in the nation about, well, let me just start sort of from the beginning to add some context. And that is that, I guess it was Thanksgiving 1984. I had been involved with the group Trans-Africa as well as CITSA. Trans-Africa was a group formed by Randall Robinson. Should I say something about it, or can I assume people will know?
Just, it's up to you if you want to go in more detail.
Well, yeah, Trans-Africa was an organization that was organized in the 1970s by Randall Robinson. And it was an organization that was organizing African Americans in particular around foreign policy issues to do with Africa and the Caribbean. And so I had become a part of Trans-Africa like maybe 1981. And by 1982, Trans-Africa had what they called support committees all over the United States. And so I was the head of the support committee in Chicago, and then I became head of all the support committees across the United States. So in 1984, Randall Robinson, the founder of Trans-Africa, along with 3 other people, Mary Frances Berry, at the moment I can't remember who the other 2 were, but they were 4 African Americans, 2 of whom were in Congress, decided to go to the South African embassy in Washington, D.C., and to sit in and refuse to leave after they'd had a meeting with the ambassador. And they did so as a way of protesting apartheid. This became a huge thing that spread all over the United States, so that there were people sitting in at South African consulates or businesses that did work with South Africa or the embassy in Washington, D.C., and it became a kind of a thing to do. It's like in the 60s we used to sing, "Have you been to the jail?" Yes, I have. Have you been to the jail? Yes, I have. Where people saying, yes, I did it. I did my part. And so that's how the South African protest became like, have you been to jail? So a lot of celebrities started doing it and all that. But anyway, to get back to my point, I got a call on Thanksgiving Eve from Solly Booker, who was an assistant to Randall Robinson. And he said, Cheryl, Randall, Mary Frances Berry, the other 2 people are at the South African embassy and they're not leaving. And so, they're probably going to get arrested, which eventually they did. And you got to make something happen in Chicago. I'm like, really, Sally? So the next day, Thanksgiving, I started calling people in the activist community. And by that time, it had been announced on radio and TV that they had been arrested. And I was saying, we have a consulate in Chicago. We need to make something happen. So, we had several meetings. One of them was at the, and this speaks to the issue of all black or all white. On the south side, the Center for Inner City Studies, and a number of people there had been working for years on the anti-apartheid issue within the black community and only with black people. And so I made sure to get in touch with them, Bob Starks, and I'm trying to remember a couple of other names. But so finally we had a meeting, and I decided to have the meeting at the Center for Inner City Studies because I wanted to and not at the usual haunts of left activists, because I wanted to make sure that the black community was drawn into this and that we were, a truly integrated community in terms of going forward. So we planned a march in front of the South African embassy. I think it was December 6th, maybe, 1984. Turned out to be one of the coldest days of the year. It was horrible. But we had over 1,000 people there, and we were marching and singing and shouting, and we had arranged for a couple of members of SIDSA to go upstairs to the South African Council. I think it was on the 5th or 6th floor. Well, because all of these protests had been happening around the country, we didn't think they would let black people in the door, frankly, because as soon as they saw black people, they were going to be like, no, you can't come in. So we sent up some white people to get the door open.
Wow.
So first it was a woman I traveled to Cuba with, who was very active, and it's a Jewish woman, Ora Shub, who, bless her soul, is dead now. But anyway, so Ora agreed to go up. She's a nice, innocent-looking little, I didn't think they knew she was Jewish. So she knocked on the door, and first she was like, I want to get a visa, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, she talked to me to open the door. So she came in, they closed it right behind her, so they did a couple of things, and then when she got ready to leave, they tried to get her to go out the back way. And she said, no, I'm afraid. I want to go out the front door. So they opened the front door to let her out, and then about 8 people bum rushed it. So it was an integrated group of people, black and white, who just bum rushed the front door. So they all got arrested. The upshot of it was that we ended up having one of the first trials in Chicago, first trials in the United States, but it was in Chicago, testing what was known as the necessity defense. And basically, the necessity defense argues that you can commit a smaller crime, not you can't kill somebody, but like trespassing, which is what they were charged with, if in fact it is to try to impact a larger crime, which the lawyers argued was apartheid. So they argued that trespassing was something that, shouldn't be charged if in fact you were doing it as an action to end apartheid, which was a much greater crime. And we won. We were the first. Several people had tested the necessity defense but didn't win. But we won in Chicago. It was written up in the New York Times. It was a really big deal. And so, I was the person really, along with Alice Palmer, helped a lot in organizing that action and a number of other actions. The other thing that CISA did was to go all around the United States too, but primarily in Illinois. We used to go and give talks about apartheid because, frankly, in the 1980s, a lot of people didn't really know about apartheid, didn't understand it. There were a lot of people here who were dealing in South African coins, even companies that were flying the South African flag, outside of their buildings. And there began then to be huge conferences in the 80s about apartheid because there was an argument that the United States should divest from investment in South Africa. So there was an attempt to get divestment at the level of the nation, but also at the level of various states and cities and all that. The Chicago City Council, led by Danny Davis, actually passed legislation to do that. And another person who was very helpful at the state level, who later became the first black woman ever, not even just since Reconstruction, elected to the Senate, Carol Moseley Braun, who really helped us, along with Danny Davis. The other person was Senator Paul Simon. I served on Senator Paul Simon's. He had an anti-apartheid committee. And so I served on that. And, so there was a lot of stuff going on at the time. Probably anti-apartheid at that time was the main issue in which I was involved. I don't even remember the question I was answering.
Me either, but that's okay. Let's move on to life and activism since 2010 specifically, starting with Nelson Mandela's death in 2013. What was your reaction to that?
Of course I was sad. I mean, this is a man who gave his life to the struggle. And it's amazing that he survived for so long, in prison. The other thing, I guess, was that, when Mandela was released, I mean, it was such a huge thing. First of all, nobody was actually expecting it so soon. And then, we were expecting him to be elected. But, after he stopped serving as president, because, again, I guess my reaction was kind of twofold. One, sadness. The second being thinking that perhaps this would be a springboard for there to begin to be even more change in South Africa, people remembering, revisiting, thinking, because, he made some compromises. It's like I'm always saying to people, although I probably didn't get here until I was 50, that between doing nothing and getting everything you want, between getting nothing and getting everything, there's a space that, along a continuum which you move to try to get everything that you want. And so certainly Mandela moved the struggle in South Africa along that continuum a bit, but not a whole lot. I mean, the huge thing was that the majority of the population got the vote and got their representation in someone who was leading the country. But there was so much else left to do. And so when Mandela died, I was hopeful that that would remind us all again of how much there was left to do. In was it 2019? Yeah, I think it was a year before the pandemic. I went to South Africa with Prexy Nesbitt and a couple of other people. And, it was amazing to see so little change, frankly. Now, that's in context. There was a lot of change in the sense that Black people could go wherever they wanted, as long as they had the price of the ticket. It was like Martin Luther King saying, segregation is over, but if you can't afford to eat in the restaurant or stay in the hotel, it's kind of symbolic, and in South Africa, of course, Black people were voting. Of course, theoretically, they could go any place they wanted and do anything they wanted. But because of a lack of redistribution of land, because of a lack of finding ways to redistribute wealth, the same thing happened that had happened in previous African colonies. You sometimes got a layer of Africans between most of the people and white people. And, they were a layer that was perhaps in elective office. Maybe they became rich, by participating in the economy in certain ways. Maybe they were totally corrupt, and that's how they became rich. But the point is that most of the people had not seen a significant enough change in their lives between 1994 and 2019. So, for instance, we visited Soweto, the famous Soweto. And we saw many people moving to do things for themselves. That is, if the state didn't respond to their needs, they did things for themselves. So, for instance, there were several places in Soweto where people were taking electricity from the state. They didn't have electricity. 2019, there was no electricity in areas of Soweto. So, they took lines because, Soweto wasn't 1,000 miles away, and ran it into, the township in order for people to have electricity. And in fact, just before we came, some children had gotten electrocuted because they hadn't hung the electric lines high enough. And so then, this is just the people. They made a decree that you had to hang the electricity lines at least 12 feet in the trees so that no kid could jump up playing ball or something and get electrocuted. So my point is that they were just taking it. They were also beginning to make deals, I guess, with, deal sounds like a corrupt word, but to work with foundations, individuals, to get libraries stocked, to get computers, so that people could come and use computers, to get all kinds of resources that the state was not giving. And you still saw people, living in a certain kind of poverty. And, I was in the South in the 60s, and I've never seen poverty anywhere worse than right here in the good old U.S. of A. Mm-hmm. But, there was still that kind of poverty, And so we felt like there was still, and still continued to do things, give money, work here to get places like the Ford Foundation and others to give money. But there's still so much else to be done in South Africa. So I don't know if that's so. And I guess I talked about 2017, about the Women's March. Maybe I should say something else about that. Should I?
Let me look through here.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can talk about the Women's March. Like, what specifically was your role in the committee?
Where my goal was to make sure that, it's interesting, because and this was true of the marches around the country, because even the D.C. March, which was the big march, and which developed the demands that all the other marches signed, went through a big turmoil, because at first it was led by women, all white women, who had very little experience in activist struggle. But, what had motivated them was, Hillary Clinton having gotten so much more of the vote than Donald Trump, but still not being elected president because of the Electoral College. And so in D.C., there was a scrambling, and I say this as context for what happened here in Chicago. There was a scrambling to bring women of color into the leadership, and particularly women of color who had had experience in activist struggle. And so there was a big shakeup. Well, in Chicago, I went to the first meeting that was called, and it was overwhelmingly white women. And it was me, Jackie, who was a union woman. I don't know, maybe we were the only two black women at the first meeting. I was shocked, first of all. Although there was a big debate in the African American community among women about whether they should participate, because they felt that, the focus was too much on white middle-class women, and that the focus wasn't really on, what was going on in women's lives overall, issues of poverty, issues of mental, blah, blah, blah. And so here in Chicago, when I went to the first meeting, I was like, oh, this can't happen like this. And they were women who worked very hard, but who had no prior experience in struggle or organizing. So that was when I decided, even though I was like, I don't know, what was I then, almost 70? And I had sort of stepped back, and I was like, no, I got to be in this. Not because I'm so great, but because it needed some diversity. And so I got involved. I ended up being on the organizing committee. There were probably 10 or 12 of us on the organizing committee. And so one of the things that I think women of color brought to that organizing committee was, first of all, the notion that we needed to reach out to communities of color. And the notion that just as the DC organizing committee was being shaken up in terms of writing its list of demands, that we should shake up and we should sign on to those listed demands, because some of the committees were saying, we don't know if we want to sign on those, the demands are so radical. We were like, really? And then we, besides reaching out to women of color wanting to sign on to those demands, we also wanted to talk about who was going to speak, who were going to be the speakers. And so we ended up integrating, like, for instance, we got somebody from Black Lives Matter to be a speaker. This I thought was one of the biggest things, skipping ahead a little bit, but the march ended with a Muslim woman doing the call to prayer. And I thought, oh my God, she's doing Allahu Akbar. I mean, that we ended up having that kind of diversity. But the other thing that happened, which was wonderful, is that we were hoping for 10,000 women. And then as we were moving on, we thought, wow, we could have 25,000 women. We had 250,000 women.
Wow.
And we couldn't march. So we did what we called march in place. So we just did it from, we had a stage. And we did it from the stage. I mean, you couldn't even see, there were so many women everywhere. And the women on the edges said that they tried to march, but 250,000 women, and we had been lucky enough to be able to do a pre-march call for the march. Where were we? I think we were at City Hall, but anyway, all the news stations were there. And so I spoke, several other people spoke. There were about 4 of us that spoke. And it was just, it was incredible. We talked about, the rights of differently abled women. We talked about the rights of women of color. We talked about the rights of immigrant women. We talked about the rights of, women in suburbia. We talked about all of that stuff. And I mean, some of the worst stuff hadn't even happened yet, like Roe v. Wade and all that sort of stuff. But it was wonderful. And so it was just a big thing. They continued to have some marches, but nothing was like 2017, right after the election of Trump. But anyway.
What about after George Floyd? What was it like giving public lectures?
Really interesting. Now, I only gave a couple. 2 of them at churches, and one of them at university. So 3, actually. So the thing about George Floyd that floored me and many old activists, I mean, we're getting old, some of the people who were involved in the 60s. I'm 75, Prexy's 77. I mean, I called up some of my friends and I said, oh my God, are all these young white people out there? Now, it's not that white people and young white people were not ever involved before. They were involved in the South, in the Civil Rights Movement. They were involved certainly in the anti-war movement, if not taking the lead. And they were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. But when you turned on the television with the George Floyd protests, and you saw them all over the world, not just all over the country, and you saw huge numbers of young white people, I'd never seen anything like that before. And it seemed like a generational difference. It seemed like younger white people really understood far better than their parents had, even though some of them had been raised by racist parents. I mean, after all, we're not talking a long time here, okay? We're not talking a long time here. But still, these were people who got it, who understood, who were willing to sacrifice and be on the front lines, and who got beaten, arrested, shot. So it was like, oh my God, something is changing in terms of these George Floyd protests. Something is changing. Something is changing about the way younger white people see this country, about how they understand the nature and the need for police reform, about how they're willing to not just sit in class and say, yeah, that's horrible, but to put their bodies on the line. And in fact, I had volunteered, although they didn't end up using, several of us volunteered, to be what they were calling mothers of the march, so that you get on the front line, you'd be in front, hoping that being old would make the police think twice maybe about, pushing people, shooting people, grabbing people. Didn't always work in the places where it happened. But anyway, it was the thought. So I think George Floyd was a real turning point, and, people have debated whether more is happening in terms of police violence or whether we just know more about it. Because now we have cell phones, we have people paying attention, we have, police have to wear body cams in many places. This is all stuff that didn't exist 10 years ago. So was there more, or do we just know more about it? I think both are true. Mm-hmm. That we know more about it. And that's why there are places you're trying to pass laws that say you can't film a policeman. Why? Why would you not have the right to film a policeman in course of the duty, as long as you're not in the way? But anyway, it was definitely a turning point, I think. I hope we're not getting lost in the weeds now, though.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that we seem to have failed in passing some kind of national reform that the federal government can enforce. We seem to have failed in doing away with qualified immunity for policemen. This is what people don't realize. When we think of the probably hundreds of millions of dollars that have been paid in police brutality cases, who do you think foots that bill? Me and you. The municipalities, the cities, the states. The police don't foot that bill. The police unions don't foot that bill. That's why qualified immunity needs to go. Taxpayers foot that bill. We pay all of those awards. Most people don't even think about that.
Yeesh.
Yeah. Where do you think the money comes from?
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Secret pot? No. And it doesn't come from police unions. It doesn't come from policemen. It comes from you and me. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess now I'll ask about your experience as a dean at Columbia College Chicago. How was that?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I came to Columbia from a previous position as chair of the history department at Loyola. So Loyola is a very traditional university. Now it's traditional, but because of the Catholic background, there are two sort of balancing things. And I'm saying that to contrast what happened at Columbia. On the one hand, you have the conservative element of Catholics, but on the other hand, you have the Catholic tradition of working in social justice. So at universities, they're always interacting. I'm not going to say they're in conflict, they're always interacting. So I said that to say that I had already had, as I was the first woman and the first Black person, be chair of the history department at Loyola. And so there were some things that I tried to do that I felt were progressive things. And, they involved everything from establishing a women and gender studies program to admitting the first African-American graduate students. Oh my God, in 1995, really, guys? But so I think that partially that's how I came to the attention of Columbia, because Columbia called me. And I had a job. I wasn't applying for a job. And I know partially, too, my son had gone to Columbia. He was a student here still, Rashid Johnson, who is a nationally and internationally lauded artist. But anyway, so he was here, and what was the guy who was chair of photography at the time? John, oh my God, I am 75. Anyway, he really took an interest in Rashid, and we had dinner together and so forth. So he and Louis Silverstein and somebody else, when they were looking for actually a chair of what they called liberal studies, I think, they hadn't found anybody they wanted, and so they both said, you really need to call me. So they called me and asked me to come down. So I did come down, and eventually I decided to take the job because I thought that, Columbia has a very progressive history. And even now, it's not as progressive as it used to be, but it still has a very progressive history, and I thought I could really do some things there. And then I took the job as head of liberal studies. And then Columbia was talking about changing the academic structure. And one of the ways that they were thinking of changing it was to establish deanship positions. And so I was very much in favor of that, because one of the things I was in favor of was helping the liberal arts become more integrated into the visual, performing, et cetera, arts here at Columbia, and arts administration. Not as a way of changing, the way that people focused on the arts, but in saying that the more knowledge you have about the world, the better any kind of artist you can be, because there's so much more to call on. And if you don't make it as a painter, there's something else you really can do. And so, in any case, I, along with some other people, were writing papers about how this new structure would be good for Columbia. And so they decided to do it. And so then they did a national search for the Dean of Liberal Arts. And I was one of the candidates, but, there were candidates from all over the country. And so I was chosen as the first dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Now, they talked about calling it the School of General Studies at first. I was extremely opposed to that. It sounded like a nothing, an add-on, a little piece of decoration. And so I thought it should be called what it's called everywhere else, liberal arts and sciences. Columbia is a real university. It should have real names for things, not just general studies. I mean, it's called general studies some places, but not good places. So it became, liberal arts and sciences. And, in that role, my desire was to do things that truly integrated the study of the liberal arts and sciences into the arts. And I think we made a lot of headway in doing that. For instance, we established a cultural studies major, which exists in many places. And there was initially a lot of pushback about doing that. But we got it, and it's a great thing, and it's very connected to the arts. We, did other things, established a different kind of freshman seminar than the one that existed, and a couple of other things. So I think my time here at Columbia was good. I hope it was good for Columbia. It was good for me. So.
It sounds like it was very good.
And Columbia gave me an honorary degree, too, by the way. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
In
20, oh my God. It was before the pandemic, 2019, maybe? 2018? I'm sorry. I think it was 2019.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it was cool.
Was it in liberal arts and sciences, or what?
No,
was
it was just an honorary degree.
Honorary degree. Oh,
Yeah.
That's just like a general thing that you can have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's so cool.
Most universities do it. Yes, it was very cool. I really appreciated it.
How is this different than your position at Dominican?
Well, I was at Columbia. I got called by a search firm about Dominican's position, and so I wasn't interested, and because I thought I was near enough to retirement that it didn't make sense, although I ended up staying there 10 years. So then I went, and one of the things that I liked about Dominican, again, it was one of those Catholic schools like Loyola, and maybe even more so than Loyola, and a lot more so than DePaul. I don't even know I should be saying this, but this is what I believe, that had a very progressive leadership. It had been a women's school, and it had always been led by women nuns. And the president under whom I've suffered, that was probably... I'm going to leave it there, but under whom I served was the first lay woman president. That probably came out because we did knock heads.
Yeah.
She had the interests of Dominican in heart, blah, 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 but we knocked heads sometimes. In any case, finally I was convinced by faculty to take that position. One of the faculty members who was a leader of the faculty, Rosalind Hayes, her husband was on my faculty in the history department at Loyola. And so we had met before, had interacted a lot, and she introduced me to some of the other faculty, and both Roz and Joe, her husband, were very progressive. And they were like, we really need somebody progressive to take this position. And so, really they got me together with some other faculty who were like, you really, really would like to do this. So, of course, I was part of a national search, so it wasn't up to them. But they were the ones that convinced me to stay in the search, because I had actually thought initially, after meeting a few people who shall remain nameless, of dropping out. I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this because they're not going to be able to deal with me, and I'm not going to be able to deal with them. But they convinced me to stay in. And I didn't. Eventually, I got the offer, and I really think it was because of the faculty. Because I'm not sure that I was truly the first choice of some of the people on the board, for instance, or perhaps even the president. I'm not sure. But I got the offer, and I decided to take it. So Dominican was more of a traditional university, sort of. I mean, it had a very active art department. It had an active theater department. But the thing that it did have was that it had a very progressive tradition. And it became a school that was committed to defending and protecting immigrants, particularly immigrants from Latin America. And so I became very interested in that mission of Dominican. And it was also very interested in diversifying its student population in terms of African Americans and, others here in the States, Asian Americans, Muslims. I mean, it really, for instance, it established a room for Muslims to do prayer. And it admitted a lot of dreamers before there was a dreamer, designation. And in fact, one of the, stellar students from Dominican, Berto Aguayo, used to be a gangbanger on the West Side. And then he became very involved with black gangbangers. He was Latino. And then they started doing this Black and Latino Unity Day. And he did all of this stuff, and Dominican really turned his life around. And now he's a student at Northwestern Law School. And this guy is going places. He's either going to run for Congress or something. And not only is he bright, does he have a background where he really understands the issues of people on the ground, but and is progressive. But he's gone places. I believe he's going to be mayor or congressman or something. And Dominican turned out people like that, particularly African Americans and Latinos. And so I was happy to be able to do some of the things like that I did at Dominican, to be able to participate in some of the very progressive things that I cooked up with faculty. And the president was progressive too. Of course, she, I try to understand, she had, I guess, harder things on her shoulder than, I don't know if she really had harder things than I did, but anyway, it was, she was cool. She was cool.
Yeah. So you're retired now, correct?
I am.
And how has that affected your activism?
It has affected it some. I'm not just retired, but I'm old. So I'm 75. Mm-hmm. So I would say that most of my activism now has been in a consulting role. Although I'm trying to think, besides the George Floyd stuff and just marching and that and all of that, I don't think that I have organized anything, or I still give talks, I still work with people who are very active in the streets, so to speak. For instance, several of my friends are on Brandon Johnson's transition committee, and that's really cool. So, I don't know what's going to happen. I know everybody in the world is coming for him. And he did one disappointing thing recently, but it's temporary. So, I'm still an advisor to them, and consulting with them. But I've made a kind of a hard right-hand turn, and that is, I've published a lot of things, but all my publications are academic, my books, my articles. And I've started writing fiction.
Really?
But a lot of the fiction is, I believe that the best fiction writers, I'm not saying I'm one of the best, because that's yet to be determined, but the best fiction writers use something about their lives, even if the fiction is sci-fi or whatever it is, because it's yourself that you tap for, how situations go, what feelings are like, blah, 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 blah. And so I have found myself tapping myself, and particularly some of my activist career, for some of my fiction. And so in a sense, it's replaying itself, if you will, into another life of short stories right now. And I'm hoping to make one of them a book, the title of which is Beauty, Loveness, and Gift. Now, when I was in Zambia, I've been on several boards, but anyway, I traveled all over Africa, but I was in Zambia for this educational committee. And I met kids with all these names, and I met 3 little girls. Now, I met them at different times, but one was named Beauty, one was named Loveness, and one was named Gift. And I thought, wow, so the 3 protagonist girls in this story are Beauty, Loveness, and Gift. So that's one that sort of certainly I tapped into my activist career to write that. So
that's so cool. Yeah. All right, let's talk about some current events. Have Have you heard of the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones?
Oh, sure.
How did you react to that? What are your thoughts?
Oh, I think it was a fantastic thing to do, and I think she's done a really good job with it. I mean, at first, my knee-jerk reaction was 1619 is not the first time black people came to this continent, North America. There were black people in Florida in the 1500s, but 1619 is the general date for the arrival of the first slaves in Jamestown. And so I get why she started with that date. I just wish there had been a little bit about the black presence in North America before them. But I think she did a great job. I think that the kind of exposure that she gave to African American history and the kind of exposure she gave to the centrality of race, slavery in the history of this country is almost unprecedented. There are thousands of historians, don't get it twisted, who have done wonderful work, most of which most people don't know a damn thing about. If you don't take a course, you don't go to the library, you don't care. But the 1619 Project is unmissable. You can't miss it. It's out there in your face. And so I think it's great.
Awesome. What are some of your hopes for the new mayor, Brandon Johnson?
First of all, I hope that they can't just stop him in his tracks like they did Barack Obama and Harold Washington. Okay. Barack Obama had such a progressive agenda until he became president. And I don't think it was all on him that it didn't all materialize. I mean, he did a wonderful thing with health care. That was his, but there were so many other things that they just, tripped him up on. Closing Guantanamo, appointing a Supreme Court justice. I could go on and on and on. Same thing with Harold Washington. I'm hoping that Brandon Johnson, like I said, I know some of the people that are advising him. They are smart people. And they are dedicated people. And they've been in struggle all their lives. And I'm hopeful, given what he did with the city council, that victory will enable him to have some subsequent victories. I don't know if you know that he completely reorganized the city council. Everybody was shocked that he was able to do that. The fact that he was able to do it gives me great hope that he's going to be able to do some other things. So I hope that he is able to deal with the causes of violence, the root causes of violence, which he has addressed in the things that he said. I mean, people don't just go out and shoot everything up because they're stupid or crazy. They may be stupid and crazy, but a lot of it is they don't have anything else to do. They don't have jobs, they don't have, community centers, they don't have a damn thing, and they don't have education that enables them to understand how stupid and crazy it is to do that and what a dead-end street it is. So he has talked about trying to address those root causes of violence in Chicago. I'm really hopeful that he'll make some headway on that. I'm hopeful that he'll make some headway on other, issues of inequity, which have to do with housing, which have to do with health care, which have to do with education. I just hope that, he did reappoint temporarily a former police chief that is suspect. But it's temporary, I hope, and because the police and the police unions are a big issue, in Chicago. And not just in Chicago, but, Chicago is one of the places targeted by the Eric Holder administration, under Obama, in terms of cities that really needed to go back to the drawing board about how the police are organized and, how they're educated, how they're reprimanded, how, citizen review boards, etc. I hope he's able to really make some headway on that. And that is a huge, huge thing in his side that is going to be very, very difficult to do. I hope he has Pritzker on his side, who's a pretty progressive guy himself. And I think has his eyes on the presidency someday. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I like the things he says. I like some of his beginnings, although the police chief thing, has me a little gobsmacked, but, maybe he's between a rock and a hard place. I don't know everything he knows. So we'll see.
Yeah. Why do you think critical race theory has became as central as it is to the culture wars and debate over what is and what is not American history?
Because none of those people know a doggone about critical race theory. I'm just saying, first of all, the notion of outlawing the teaching of critical race theory, K through 6, whatever they're doing, it has never been taught K through 6. Nobody wants to teach it K through 6. Nobody's talking about doing that. What are they talking about? It's all this pie in the sky. Let me show how right-wing and stupid I can be.
Save the children.
Yeah, it's just, it's ridiculous. And most of them can't spell critical race theory, much less tell you what it is.
Still trying to figure out what squares are and stuff,
Yeah, so I think critical race theory has become this crazy, if you will, unknown that is brandished like the term woke. He probably has no idea that the term woke started in the leftist community. He probably has no idea that it was leftists that were first saying, stay woke. But anyway, they have co-opted it, have changed it into something against leftists. It's kind of hilarious when you know the history. But so the same thing is true of critical race theory. They have no idea that its origins were in law schools and that it started out as something to examine the inherent racism in our system of criminal justice. That's where critical race theory started, places like Harvard, law school, etc. And then it became a way of examining the centrality of race institutionally in the United States. That's what critical race theory is. And so most people, when they're talking about racism or how to deal with racism, first thing people say, I'm not racist. Racism isn't about your individual feelings. Racism is about the institutionalization, the centrality of race in our institutions in a negative way. So, it's not about, like I said, whether you're a racist or whether, whatever. So that's what critical race theory attempts to do. It attempts to trace how race has been central in the application of, in the workings of, but particularly it started looking at criminal justice institutions and now looking at all of our institutions. So, for instance, it might look at the Constitution and say, everybody said, well, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, but the word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution other than in the 13th Amendment, which, by the way, says, it outlaws slavery, but it says you can have slavery for certain reasons. It's hilarious when you read it. Most people don't even know that.
Yeah, within the prison systems, right?
I'm sorry?
Within the prison
That's
systems,
right. Well,
that's
it allows the prison systems to treat people like slaves in the sense that, you may get paid, I don't know what they get paid these days, $1 an hour or something. But you can, it leaves open the door, I guess is all that I'm saying, for debt, for instance, or something. But anyway, maybe there's a law against debtors' prisons, but there wasn't always. So when people argue, for instance, that we have to pay attention to the original Constitution, they forget things like their precious Second Amendment was not a part of the original Constitution. It was part of the first 10 amendments to the original Constitution. The whole Bill of Rights is. So, but, I'm just saying that critical race theory will do things like look at the Constitution, like look at the operation of the criminal justice system, like look at, the educational system, and how, like now they're trying to take, and maybe this is what they're afraid of in critical race theory, to take the educational system back 50 years. They're doing things like removing Rosa Parks' name from school books, banning books, changing the narrative of history. I saw this meme on Facebook, and it showed Ruby Bridges. I don't know if you know who she was, but yeah, okay. So she was that little 6-year-old girl that integrated schools in Louisiana, and they're saying things like, if she could do what she did, your kid can stand hearing about it. If that 6-year-old could integrate that school, your kid can stand hearing about it. They don't want people to know the true history of this country. And I don't want to use words like true. I don't use true and false. The accurate history of this country. They don't want them to know the accurate. Part of the reason I believe they don't want them to know it is because of George Floyd. And what I mean by that is when people know the accurate history, that's when they're out there in the streets. That's when they can understand police brutality. That's when they can understand unequitable or inequitable application of the death penalty. That's when they can understand all that kind of stuff, when they have the accurate history. And so it's not something new to them, not something crazy, because they know all the laws that supported it, all the infrastructure, if you will. So anyway, I think that critical race theory is being employed by people who know nothing about it, know nothing about its origins, know nothing about its application, know nothing about how and where it's taught. And it's become brandished in the same way that, other nonsense has, like LGBTQ, like they're all sexual predators. It's being brandished like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about Trump.
Okay. I would try to keep my language as clean as possible.
PG-13 is fine, right?
Charlotte?
PG-13 language?
You can do any language you want.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
I'll still be cool.
Okay, great. So what do you think the significance was of the U.S. 2016 presidential election?
It's interesting. I had friends calling me from all over the world saying, what the hell?
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is that most, for instance, of the most trusted news outlets in this country never believed he was going to be elected. Look, he didn't believe he was going to be elected. He admitted it himself. He was shocked that he got elected, okay? So why do I think that happened? And I've asked myself that question for years. I've even been in study groups that said, what the hell happened? First of all, one of the debates, one of the beliefs is that Obama, because it was a black president, and it's interesting. I think it was a Pew Research Center that did this study, but they asked white people if Obama was the first black president, or was he the first mixed race president, or was he, whatever. Of course he was mixed race, but in this country, and so, I think it was 90% of white people said he was mixed race, not black. And so 95% of black people said he was black, and not that they were saying he was not mixed race, or that white people were saying he was not black, but they were talking about in their heads when they voted, when they thought about him, when they analyzed what he had done. So Barack Obama was asked this question himself, and he said, when he went out to catch a cab, he said, when I leave this building, I'll go downstairs and catch a cab. This was in New York. He said, nobody's going to say, I'm going to stop and pick him up. He's a mixed race guy. They pass me by just like they do any other black man. So, because in this country, for the most part, recently we've got a new census category for mixed race kids because the mixed race category has gotten much bigger. But your treatment externally in society, when somebody looks at you, if you look black, you are black. And that's how you get treated, whether it's the police or the teacher or whomever the hell it is, the hospital, nurse. So Obama being the first black president was such a huge thing. I mean, the reaction in this country, a lot of the negative reaction didn't get the coverage it deserved. I mean, one of the things that Mitch McConnell said right after Obama was elected was, well, our first priority is to make sure he doesn't get another term. He said that. I mean, you can look it up in a clip on YouTube. But my point is that, so that was their priority, to make sure Obama didn't get another term. He had the most and the first protection, because so many threats against his life. And while in his term, he passed a law about protection continuing for his children after he got out, because it was horrible. I don't know if you remember all the names that they called them. Anyway, my point is that Obama again raised the specter of who black people were going to be in this country. And along comes Trump, who had exploited that before Obama was elected. If you remember, Trump was one of the leaders of demanding that Obama show his birth certificate. He was one of the leaders of that whole movement. And so he was already digging the ground, prepping it, picking up the rocks for people to crawl out from under. So, Trump coming out initially, in his initial campaign, he did it in almost a hidden way. Clearly he was appealing to white nationalists, but he was trying to sometimes hide it, and sometimes it was only a couple of years in where he just out and out said, But so one of the reasons, I think, was Obama being president, black president. The other thing I think is that, you began to get the flames fanned of the idea that somehow white people were going to become a minority in this country. So what if they do become a minority? I'm just saying,
It's like they're admitting it's like worse than
I mean, is that what if this country becomes so diverse that everybody's a damn minority, that there is no majority? So what? Because what they're connecting it with is what it means to be a minority in a racist society. And so they're saying, I once heard, I forget who said this, that the person you fear the most is the person you have wronged. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because you feel like they're going to treat you just like you treated them. So I think that's the other thing. You begin to get the flames fanned of the notion that white people are going to be overtaken. Hence our policies about immigration, which, by the way, didn't change until the 1960s. I mean, before that, Africans could hardly get in here. Indians could hardly get in here. Other South Asians, anyway. The point is that there was a concern about white people being a minority and what they thought that meant, because they knew how they treated minorities. Then I think there was this whole notion of, what and who this country was founded by, and who it is, what it really is. And it depends on who you listen to. Is it a misreading or is it not a misreading of the Constitution and the so-called founders and the mission of the country? Is it a misreading to say it's racist through and through and they never meant anything else? Or that it's the shining city on the hill, like Reagan said, and we just haven't achieved it yet? There are people on both sides of that. Frederick Douglass, who was a black abolitionist, very famous, and William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist who was very famous, argued different sides of that question. William Lloyd Garrison, the white guy, maintained that this was a country that was racist through and through, and we had to start all over again. Frederick Douglass maintained that the mission of the country was the city on the shining hill, and we just didn't get there yet. So Obama, as well as most of our politicians, always maintain we haven't gotten there yet. But now we're beginning to see, I think, more and more people, mostly racist, and white nationalists, saying, no, you were never supposed to be a part of this. This is really about us. We designed it, we made it. Even though without the Chinese, we wouldn't have a railway system. Without African Americans, we probably wouldn't have a country at all. Slavery was, cotton was the major crop of the entire country. between 1830 and 1860. But anyway, so I think that's another reason for Trump. And I think that, interestingly enough, class has not been understood. This is the last thing I'll say. Understood as a real issue in this country. And because we always try to get white people to conflate class with race. Now, it is true that there are more poor black people, more poor South Asians or whatever, but the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of poor white people. It's just like during the period of slavery, there were far more poor white people than slave owners. But what did slave owners do to get poor white people on their side? They said, you're white, you're white, you're white. And therefore, you can become anything you want. You too can become a slaveholder. Of course, it wasn't true. There could never be a majority of slaveholders. But they convinced white people that as long as they maintained the privileged white status for themselves, they couldn't recognize their own interests. Their interests lay in overthrowing slavery, so they could have land, so they could have jobs. Same thing has continued on, that poor white people continue to be taught, encouraged to identify with rich white people and think that they too, as long as they're white. Now, there is such a thing as white privilege, but it doesn't mean that you can go as high as you want to go if you're really, really poor. What white privilege means is not that you're rich either. It means that you don't get followed around in a store, that you don't start trembling every time the cops pull you over. I mean, white skin does have a privilege of the sort of the assumption of innocence. It has a privilege. If a white person does something, people don't say, boy, those white people. If a black person does something, people are like, well, that's how they are. You know what I mean? So as a white person, you are an individual. That's white privilege too. But I think the idea that class has never sufficiently been analyzed, because it's almost like it's un-American. If you raise the issue of class, you're a communist, or something. So you don't examine it. So therefore, poor white people can't say, where do my interests really lie? Do my interests lie in keeping black people out of the labor union or bringing them in the biggest numbers we can? They finally understood that the latter was in their best interest, but at first they thought the former was in their best interest. So I think our inability to talk about class as a central issue in U.S. history fans the flame of racism. When Hillary Clinton first tried to do health care, what did they do? They said, health care is for them. If you need health care, there's something wrong with you because we're all individuals here. We're all responsible for ourselves. Well, we're not, because that's not what it means to be in community. But they got white people to be against health care initially by acting like it was just for black people. That's what she was trying to do. It's like that woman who lived in West Virginia who was interviewed. I forgot who it was now. Anyway, she was talking about her black lung disease was already covered. She didn't need Obamacare, blah, blah, blah. And the guy said, ma'am, that is Obamacare that's covering it. She's like, oh. So, and the last thing I'll say, in the 1890s, there was a very important movement in this country. And it was a movement between black and white farmers. And they got together because they understood that the federal government was trying to, I don't want to use the F word, mess with both of them, okay? And so they formed this farmers' alliances, and across racial lines. Now, they were still, white people still didn't like black people, but they went ding, ding, ding. If we do this together, we have the possibility of defeating the federal government. Well, the federal government got word of that and did all kinds of things. I'm not going to go into all the details, but, to rend apart that alliance. Because they're very rich white people in this country are always afraid of cross-class alliances and cross-race alliances too. But cross-class is even more dangerous because it is inherently cross-race. So I think that's another thing that elected Trump. He completely exploited, as did the Republican Party, as it continues to do, the notion of understanding class in this country, so that poor white people, working class white people, think that as long as they're white, that protects them from class oppression. Au contraire, mon frère. And that's his constituency. Anyway, I went on too long with that.
No, I loved hearing about it.
But, anyway.
So have you heard of Feminism for the 99%, that whole feminist manifesto? Is that kind of where you're going, like with class and all that?
Yeah. I mean, because that has been inherent in the feminist movement too. Now, we're either on the fourth wave or the third wave, depending on which historian you read. Because some people talk about the first wave being pre-Civil War, the second wave being abolitionism, the third wave being, in the 1960s, and the fourth wave being now. But some people say this is the third wave. I think it's the fourth wave too, as an historian. So feminism has always had this issue. I mean, if we even only go back as far, we could go back as far as the abolitionist movement. There were lots of white women involved in the abolitionist movement, and they were true abolitionists, just like, many white men. Of course, many black women and black men were involved in the abolitionist movement, and often black women were the only ones that were allowed to speak in public, so to speak, because a white lady did not speak in public. But, they were friends, the movements are together. Then we have the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War. And basically, the 14th and 15th Amendments address the issues of equality, but the 15th in particular talks about what the rights of citizenship are. And in that amendment, it says that males have the right to vote, essentially. And that's the first time that it is made clear, although in many places women could not vote. In some places they did. But it made it clear that women were excluded from the vote. So then you get many of the former white abolitionist women organizing for suffrage. Black women organized for suffrage too. And black women, people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who were very active as abolitionists, are faced with a terrible quandary, and that is that they want black men to get the vote, because that's better than no black people having the vote. But they feel like black women should have the vote too. And white women want black women to be against the passage of that amendment, because they say it doesn't have women in it. And black women had to think for a minute and say, should we take half a loaf and continue? Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist, said, look, I'm a women's rights man, but we have to have this passed because we have to enfranchise some portion of the black community. So finally, people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth said, okay, I agree with you. We want this to pass. White women like, Susan
B. Anthony,
Elizabeth Cady Stanton were against it. So then you begin to have a split in the ranks. And so you have white women organizing for suffrage and black women organizing for suffrage separately. And you even begin to have a white women's movement for suffrage that argues that only white women should be in suffrage, should be enfranchised. You have people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even Susan B. Anthony saying things like Sambo can't be enfranchised before white women. So it gets really nasty and ugly. And in fact, in the major march in Washington, D.C., I think it was 1913, when women were marching on D.C. for the vote, they were attacked horribly. But the Illinois delegation, for instance, said to Ida B. Wells, you're black, you have to march in the back. We really don't want to be identified with black women as trying to get the vote, because by now there's so much segregation. If white people think that women being enfranchised will include black women, wahala. And so she marches in the back, but as soon as they get up near the White House, she jumps up and runs to the front. I'm not marching back. My point is, so you have this true split in the suffrage movement. And this is part of what informs feminism. Where you begin to get black women feeling like feminism does not represent them. So you get the National Association of Colored Women, forming, and you get two different suffrage movements forming that aren't on the same track, although eventually when the 19th Amendment passed, it's for all women. It doesn't say white women. But there were white women organizing for white women only suffrage. So because segregation is so horrible, and because, racism is so horrible during this time, you have black women feeling that white women's feminism, which doesn't talk about them often, doesn't represent them. And even as late as the 50s and the 60s, you have people like, I say Alice Walker. Alice Walker once said that is it women's rights is to feminism is to, oh shoot. Anyway, she was talking about the color purple. I can't remember the exact quote. And she was saying that that black women are the true feminists. And that they are the true feminists because they have to talk about intersectionality, the intersection of race, gender, and class. For instance, me, I'm sitting here before you as a black woman. Can I disaggregate? Can I be a woman someplace and then a black person? No, I'm always a black woman. There's no way for me to be something different. Yeah. And so if you're talking about race, and you're not talking about women's rights, or if you're talking about women's rights, and you're not talking about racial discrimination, where the hell does that leave me? Or all black women, or women of color, too, meaning in the world. Because one of the biggest mistakes white people make is thinking that they're in a majority in the world. Now, we all know that numbers are not the same thing as power. Otherwise, we'd all be studying Hindi or Mandarin. So we know it doesn't equate with it. But we also know that number means something. And so, the thing is that, like when I was in Africa, and there was a major conference that was while I was in Africa that was here. It was one of the first big feminist conferences in the 70s. And women came back and said, boy, those white women, I don't know how you deal with them. Because they were saying they were talking about all this stuff. You know how like progressives make a joke now. Everybody knows this joke by now, I guess, but it's starting in the progressive community where you're complaining about something and then you say, well, I know that's a first world problem. That's what they were saying. It's all about first world problems. What the hell is wrong with them? And so you really began to get this questioning of feminism. And then you get the development of the notion of intersectionality. What do you do? Well, for white women, they have intersectionality too. What about poor white women? What if you're talking about women's rights? And basically you're talking about, women's rights to attend Harvard, or women's rights to, run for office, or women's right, but you're not dealing with women's rights to eat every day, or women's rights to have health care. Then, what about all the poor white women? So intersection, Patricia Hill Collins is one of the first people that developed the notion of intersectionality. So feminism has been evolving, and certainly it evolved a lot in the 60s, and has been evolving ever since. But I guess, and when I was talking about the 2017 march, this was a feminist issue where women were saying, wait a minute. We can't have the face of this march be all white women. We can't have the manifesto for this march to be all about first world problems. And so feminism has always had this, this engine inside that keeps saying, wait a minute. Before you rush ahead and act like we're going to define feminism as a problem of men versus women. I wrote this article some time ago. It's called, is this someone who's to navigate and who's to steer? Anyway, it was about how, for instance, in a colony in Africa, that you can't just address issues of women versus men. Like, if you're talking about the redistribution of power between women and men, where there ain't no power to redistribute, you know what I'm saying? Then this is a false question. You know, you have to talk about the things that affect African people. So African feminism doesn't just talk about, you know, issues between men and women. It includes those, for sure. But it also talks about the availability of food and clean water. That's a feminist issue in Africa. You know, it talks about, you know, health care for women's bodies in childbirth. That's a feminist issue, you know, in Africa. But so is, you know, clean water and food. So is polio vaccines. You know, those are feminist issues too. Not just whether men and women earn the same salary. That's a feminist issue too, but you understand what I'm saying? So I think that's what that speaks to. Yeah, I go on way too long, but I can't help it. It's hard to explain difficult concepts in a soundbite.
I know, but it's very interesting. I'm glad you're able to come out today. So to wrap up, I'm going to ask a few reflection questions,
Okay.
starting with what the costs of your involvement were, not just in the anti-apartheid movement, but in your activism in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know some of the costs, and some of the costs I probably don't even know. I mean, I'm sure there are things that happened that I don't even know happened because somebody said, not her. You know, she's a big mouth. She's a radical or something like that. So I don't even know those things. But I would say that rather than the costs, I would say impact. And I think the impact has been far more good than it has been bad. And I mean, the bad impact may be sometimes I spent more time away from my children than I wanted to. I probably took jobs where I earned less money than, you know, I could have. I have a friend who's a multimillionaire who worked at Allstate, and I was offered a job at Allstate once, and I was like, I don't think so, because there are all kinds of things I could do at a university that Allstate would have fired me for. So, but the good impact was far greater than the bad impact. You know, the good impact was feeling like, what did Muhammad Ali say? Something like this: activism is the rent you pay for your place in the world. I mean, you know, it's, you know, we sometimes think that we can hang on to things that are good for us and bad for others, but we can't. And history certainly shows us that we can't. I mean, we're not there yet, so to speak. But I remember the first time I visited Nigeria, and I'll end with this in terms of impact. And so most people lived in horrible poverty, but there were big houses on big hills with swimming pools, and, you know, you would go in that house and you would think you were anywhere in the world. But the first time I went, those big houses on big hills were protected by gates. And then I went back a couple years later, and there were not only gates, but there were dogs running the grounds. And then I went back, and at the top of the gates was, you know, what do you call that wire?
Barbed wire?
Barbed wire, you know, and then they were electrified. I'm just saying that, you know, you keep scaling up because people who have nothing are never going to be satisfied with having nothing. Well, you have more than you need. You know, I remember my son saying to me, I took him to the dentist and I was crying all the way home about the cost. And he said, Mom, I know the problem. He said, the problem is some people have a lot more than they need and some people don't have enough. I think out of the mouths of babes, you know. So.
What have been the successes of post-apartheid South Africa?
Well, one of the biggest successes, if not the major success, has been the ability of Black people to vote. Mm-hmm. And there was always a small vote for the colored population. There was always a small vote, you know, for the East Indian population, but not for the Black population, except in their Bantustans, and, you know, and a few other people could vote. So the fact that every citizen of South Africa can vote is the absolute biggest outcome of the anti-apartheid movement and the end of apartheid. The second thing, I guess, is the symbolic victories. And those symbolic victories are that some black people get to be as corrupt as white people. I don't know that that's a victory, but my point is they couldn't even participate in that corruption before. I mean, I'm sort of joking. But that there's more access to education. There's more access to jobs. You know, you can't be turned away from a hotel if you have the price of the ticket. You know, you are not labeled anything other than a citizen of South Africa. You know, you're not, you know, African, colored, you know, Indian, white. You know, I mean, those designations don't exist anymore. I mean, culturally, you know, you may be Zulu or, you know, whatever. So I think those are the biggest takeaways, because the places that haven't been gotten to yet, the redistribution of land, the redistribution of wealth and all that, are going to be a long time coming. But those are three biggies.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I know I droned on, but I'm almost afraid to watch this. Anyway, because I probably made some mistakes too. I don't know what they are, but anyway, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it'll be great.
Thanks.